Okay, guys, today we're going to be looking at inverses. Um, what is an inverse? Well, an inverse is basically an equation that undoes what has already been done by the original equation. If the original equation is named f of x, then the inverse equation is named or denoted as f to the negative 1 of x, which we say is the inverse of f of x. We should be familiar with evaluating equations using PEMDAS, which we can think of as doing or the do process. We should also be familiar with solving equations for x. Today we are going to be solving equations with an x and a y in the equation at the same time, so we're going to use SADMEP to help us through this process. If you're unfamiliar or just forgotten PEMDAS, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. We go through these lists of steps, parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division, addition, subtraction, and then SADMEP is basically the list in reverse order. All right, so our steps for finding inverses is going to be switch x and y, solve for y, and then rewrite the inverse. So we're going to put the inverse in front of our equation. I do want you to remember that f of x is the same thing as y. So like in this very first problem, we see that it has f of x. We can just rewrite that as y equals 2x plus 5. So step 1 of this process would be to switch x and y. So if I switch x and y, we're going to get x equals 2y plus 5. Now, this next thing I want to show you, I don't always do. Some of you may feel comfortable doing this process without this, but for some people, it might be easier to kind of write out a list of what you would do following PEMDAS. So to do, if I was evaluating this problem, what's the first thing you would do on the right side of the equation? Well, you would multiply by 2, right? So multiply by 2, and then the second thing is you would add 5. So to undo, which would be our SADMEP, we would go in the reverse order. So the first thing we would do to undo is subtract 5, and then the next thing was we would do the opposite operation. That's where I got subtraction from addition. And so we had multiply by 2, so we would divide by 2. So when we look at this problem and finding an inverse, the first thing we're going to do is subtract 5 from both sides. And so that would give us x minus 5 equals 2y. And then our next step would be to divide by 2. And so that gives us y equals x minus 5 over 2. Now, you can leave your answer like this, or some of you, if you were to have to graph this, may feel more comfortable with y equals 1/2 x minus 5 halves. Just remember to divide both pieces by 2. I prefer this answer here just because it allows you to see all the steps of undoing. But like I said, if we were going to graph, we would probably want to write it like the one on the right. Your final step to this would be to write the inverse of f of x in front. And then we are done. Now, a little test that you could do to verify that this is actually the inverse, if you're wanting to check yourself, is to just pick a number to plug into your original equation. So originally, if I put 2 in, okay, if we substituted a 2 in, 2 times 2 plus 5, that would equal 9. Okay, so if our inverse equation, in fact, is an inverse, then I ought to be able to plug a 9 in and have a 2 come back out. And so if we plug 9 minus 5 over 2 in, that gives us 4 over 2, which does equal 2. So we can see that they are inverses of each other. And like I said, I'm not always going to do that test. That is a test that you can do, just like writing out the list of do to undo steps is not something that you always have to do, but it can be helpful, especially on problems with multiple steps going on. Okay. Before we do this next problem, I do want to just remind you of a little thing that you should have learned back in middle school. So multiplying by a fraction, I'm sorry, not multiplying, but dividing by a fraction is the same thing as multiplying by its reciprocal. So dividing by a half is the same thing as multiplying by 2. Multiplying or dividing by 2/3 is the same thing as multiplying by 3/2. Dividing by 3 is the same thing as multiplying by 1/3. Dividing by 4/3 is the same thing as multiplying by 3/4. And then dividing by -2 is the same thing as multiplying by -1/2. And this should be helpful for us, especially with this next problem. As you can see, we are multiplying by 1/3, so we'll end up having to divide by 1/3. So first step, switch x and y. So, or rewrite this with a y. And so we would say x equals -1/3 y minus 2. If you like that do list, our do list, we would multiply number 1 by -1/3. And then number 2, we would subtract 2. So our undo list, again, is SADMAP. We'd go in the reverse order. So we would add 2. And then we would divide by -1/3. And so if we go to undo this, add 2 to both sides, that gives us x plus 2 equals -1/3 y. Now this is where that little side lesson here is going to be very helpful. When we divide by -1/3, remember that it's the same thing as multiplying by the reciprocal. So that means that we're going to have y equals -3 times x plus 2. I would probably go ahead and write this one as -3x minus 6. So our final answer would be the inverse of f of x equals -3x minus 6. Okay? All right, on to the next example. Okay, again, we want to rewrite this with a y. So y equals 3y squared minus 4. Switch x and y. And some of you might be able to skip to this next step without rewriting the f of x as a y, and that is fine if you feel comfortable doing that. And as I can see, I made a mistake here. That should have been an x. And so y squared minus 4. And let's do that do and undo list again just for good practice. So the do, we would square. We're actually going to have 3 steps this time. So we would have to square, do our x squared. Then step 2, okay, we would have to multiply by 3. And then step 3, we would subtract 4. So our undo in this problem is going to be add 4. And we'll write this in a different color this time. So we're going to add 4. Step 2 would be to divide by 3. And then the opposite of squaring is square rooting. And so we're going to take the square root of x, or the square root of that side. So our first step, like I said, will be adding 4 because we're undoing. So that gives us x plus 4 equals 3y squared. Next step would be to divide by 3. So that gives us x plus 4 over 3 equals y squared. I suggest you just leave it as it is at the moment. When we talk about graphing later, I'll show you how to get it around the difficult part of this. Our last step is to square root. Now, the one thing I want you to make sure you remember, when we square root to solve, we need a plus or minus. So we're going to write y equals plus or minus the square root of x plus 4 over 3. So the inverse of f of x is the plus or minus the square root of x plus 4 over 3. Now make sure when you square root both sides that you include everything under the square root, because everything was already on the left. All of this was on the left before you square rooted, so it all goes under the square root when you do your answer. Okay? All right, very good. Moving on to the next example. Okay, a couple more steps involved here. So, first step, if we want to try switching x and y first, we already know that this is a y. So if you want to write x equals, and then we can put our y in there. Okay, we can write down our do list. So the first thing that we want to do is parentheses. What's in parentheses? So that tells us that we're going to subtract 3. Then we have exponents, and so it's squared, so we'd have to square. And then we would have step 3, which would be multiplication division. So we would be multiplying by -2. And then we would be looking for addition and subtraction. So we would have to add 5. So our undo list you guys can see they're progressively getting longer. We would subtract 5. Then our next step would be the previous step 3. So we're going to divide by -2. Step 3 would be our previous step 2. So we're going to square root. And then step 4 would be to add 3. And so if we follow that list, we should be able to get through this successfully. So first thing, subtract 5 from both sides. So x minus 5 equals -2 times y minus 3 squared. Then we would want to divide by -2. And so that's going to give us, and what you sometimes see is sometimes they would write -x plus 5 over a +2. They would distribute that, but it's more than fine if you just leave the denominator as a -2. Okay, so if you write x minus 5 over -2, that is perfectly fine. And so we have y minus 3 squared. Next piece would be to square root both sides. Remember, we got to put our plus or minus. So we're going to get the square root of x minus 5 over -2 equals y minus 3. We no longer need the parentheses because the squared's gone. And then we're going to add 3 to both sides. Now, the 3 was not part of the left-hand side when we took the square root, so it does not go under the square root. So when we write this out, and again, we can actually jump a step if you feel comfortable, where we know that y is going to be f of x. I'll go ahead and write it with the y by itself because some of you might be feeling a little bit overwhelmed right now, and I notice I forgot my plus or minus. So we're going to have y equals plus or minus the square root of x minus 5 over -2 plus 3. And some people may see this with a 3 in front of the plus or minus so that you don't get it confused with being under the square root. Either one of those is fine. I would probably just write this as f of x equals like I said, it doesn't matter if we want to write the 3 in front. And like I said, some people, and I hope to not confuse you on this, if you were looking at an answer key, you may see a negative x plus 5 over a positive 2, just based on if they distributed the move the negative to the top. Either way, the fraction is still negative, okay? But this would be perfectly fine as your answer. All right. We have a couple more examples. Oh, I do want to note on this problem that later on when we talk about graphing, we will have to do an extra step on this problem. But like I said, that's when we get to graphing, so no big deal. All right. H of x, same thing as f of x. So we'll go ahead and write this out with a x in its place, because remember we're going to jump that step of writing the h of x as y, that we know that, so we're good. We can probably skip our do and undo list on this one. So add 3, and so that gives us x plus 3, fix the colors, equals y cubed. And just like a square root gets rid of a square, a cube root gets rid of a cube. And so we end up with is y equals the cube root of x plus 3. So h to the negative 1 of x equals a cube root of x plus 3. And we do not need a plus or minus, because cube roots, you can take the cube root of a positive or a negative number. And this would be a good one to show you that little test again. And so if I were testing this, let's say h of 2. So h of 2 would give us 2 cubed minus 3. And so 2 cubed is 8, minus 3 is 5. And so the inverse, we should be able to plug a 5 in and get a 2 out, because it's undoing it. So if we take the cube root of 5 plus 3, that is 8, and the cube root of 8 is 2. And so we're good. It is undoing the process. All right. Another simple one here. We'll go ahead and switch x and y. So x equals the square root of y plus 4. And we can probably skip the do and undo list on this one. Well, maybe we'll talk about it, because I could see some of you guys wanting to subtract 4 first. So let's go ahead and write this out. Our do list, if we knew what x was, would be to add 4. And our second step would be to square root. So to undo, we're going to have to square first. And then our undo, our last piece of our undo would be to subtract 4. So square both sides. That gives us x squared equals, no square root anymore, y plus 4. Subtract 4 from both sides, and we get x squared minus 4 equals y. This one also will require an extra step later on, but we will talk about that at another point. Really just want to focus on being able to find the inverse and undoing these equations. And so this would be our final answer. All right, last example. So again, f of x is the same thing as y. If we skip that little step of rewriting it with a y, we end up with this. Throw our little do and undo list out there. So if we we're evaluating, again, we would use PEMDAS. So the first thing would be parentheses. And so we would have to subtract 3 from both sides. Step 2 would be to do exponents, which would cube both sides. And since there's nothing in front of the parentheses, we would then go to the +5. And so for our undo list, which is our SADMEP, we just go in reverse order. So we're going to subtract 5. Then we're going to take the cube root of x. And then we're going to add 3. And so, first thing, subtract 5. So that gives us x minus 5 equals y minus 3 cubed. Then we would take the cube root. Gives us the cube root of x minus 5 equals y minus 3. Now, the only thing that goes under the cube root is what is already on the left. And so when we add this 3, we cannot combine it with anything that's already on the left-hand side. And again, I would write it in the front. That way it's not confused with being under the cube root. And so this is what we get as our final answer. Or in this case, it was f. So the inverse of f of x is 3 plus the cube root of x minus 5. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed that lesson. Please feel free to email with any questions.